Somewhere along the way, you split yourself in half. You probably don't remember when it happened. Most people don't. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where you looked in the mirror and decided to hide part of who you are. It happened slowly, in kitchens and classrooms and living rooms, through small corrections and quiet punishments, and the look on someone's face when you were too much of something they couldn't handle. Piece by piece, you learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which ones needed to disappear. And the parts that disappeared didn't actually go anywhere. They went underground. They went into what Carl Jung called the shadow. Jung didn't stumble onto this idea casually. He arrived at it through years of working with people who couldn't figure out why their lives kept breaking in the same places. Patients who kept choosing the same kind of destructive relationship. People who sabotaged themselves right at the edge of success. Individuals who felt a constant low-grade tension they couldn't name, like they were at war with someone but couldn't identify the enemy. Jung realized the enemy was internal. It was the self they'd been forced to reject, and until they turned around and faced it, nothing in their outer life would fundamentally change. Shadow work has become one of those terms that floats around self-help spaces and spiritual communities until it's lost most of its meaning. People talk about doing shadow work the way they talk about doing yoga or journaling, like it's a practice you add to your morning routine, like it's something you can complete in a weekend workshop. What Jung described wasn't a wellness trend. It was one of the most psychologically demanding processes a human being can undertake. It requires you to meet the version of yourself you've spent your entire life running from. And most people, when they finally come face to face with that version, want to run again. Today I'm going to walk you through what shadow work actually is according to Jung's original framework, how the shadow forms, and why it contains far more than you think, the specific ways it controls your life from underneath your awareness, why most approaches to shadow work fail, and what genuine integration looks like when you stop running and finally let yourself be whole. Not the sanitized version, not the Instagram version, the real thing, the way Jung understood it, with all the discomfort and power that comes with it. So how does the shadow get built in the first place? That means going back to childhood, because that's where the construction begins. Every child comes into the world as a complete package. They have anger and sweetness, selfishness and generosity, wildness and stillness, aggression and tenderness, all of it. The full spectrum of human experience exists in a child before anyone tells them which pieces are acceptable. Then the editing starts. A boy cries and his father says men don't cry. The tears don't stop existing, they go underground. A girl gets angry and her mother looks frightened, so the girl learns that her anger is dangerous. The anger doesn't vanish, it goes underground. A child is exuberant, loud, takes up too much space, and someone tells them to sit down and be quiet. The aliveness doesn't die, it goes underground. Every time a child receives the message that some part of who they are is unacceptable, unlovable, dangerous, or too much, that part gets pushed into what Jung called the shadow. Not destroyed, stored, hidden in a place the conscious mind learns to pretend doesn't exist. The child develops what Jung called the persona instead, the acceptable version of themselves that gets approval, avoids punishment, and earns love. The persona is the mask. The shadow is everything behind it. This process isn't always dramatic. It doesn't require outright abuse, though abuse certainly accelerates it. It happens in perfectly normal families where parents are doing their best. A mother who's uncomfortable with conflict raises a child who represses their assertiveness. A father who values achievement above everything else raises a child who hides their vulnerability. A family that prizes niceness creates a child who buries their rage so deep they genuinely believe they don't have any. By the time most people reach adulthood, the shadow contains an enormous amount of psychological material. Decades of rejected impulses, denied emotions, forbidden desires, and disowned qualities. All of it alive. All of it pressing against the walls of consciousness, looking for a way out. And here's the part that surprises most people when they first encounter Jung's framework. The shadow doesn't just contain the dark stuff. It doesn't just hold your anger, your jealousy, your selfishness, your capacity for cruelty. It also holds your light. Jung was very clear about this. and it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of his work. The shadow contains whatever was rejected, regardless of whether it's positive or negative by conventional standards. If you grew up in a family where ambition was seen as selfish, your ambition is in the shadow. If confidence was punished, your confidence is in the shadow. If joy made the people around you uncomfortable, your joy went underground too. Some people have shadows filled primarily with grief and rage. Others have shadows filled with power and desire and creative fire. Most people have both. The shadow is simply the storehouse of the unlived self, everything you were told you couldn't be, shouldn't want, and weren't allowed to express. And the longer it stays unacknowledged, the more pressure it builds. This is where shadow work stops being abstract philosophy and starts being urgently practical. Because the shadow doesn't stay quiet, it can't. Repressed psychological material has energy, and energy demands expression. When you won't give it conscious expression, it finds unconscious expression instead. And that's where the real trouble begins. Jung identified several specific ways the shadow expresses itself when it's been locked away too long. And once you understand them, you start seeing them everywhere. In your own life, in other people, in entire cultures. The first and most recognizable is projection. This is when you encounter a quality in someone else that triggers an outsized emotional reaction. And the intensity of your reaction has almost nothing to do with the other person. It's your shadow material reflecting back at you from their surface. The person who infuriates you with their arrogance might be showing you the confidence you buried. The person whose neediness disgusts you might be reflecting the vulnerability you couldn't afford to show. The person whose selfishness enrages you might be carrying the self-prioritization you were never allowed. Jung didn't mean that projection accounts for every strong reaction. Sometimes, people are genuinely terrible and your response is appropriate. But he noticed that when the emotional charge is disproportionate, when someone gets under your skin in a way that feels almost personal, even though you barely know them, that's usually the shadow waving from behind the curtain. You're not just seeing them, you're seeing the rejected part of yourself wearing their face. The second way the shadow expresses itself is through repetitive patterns. The same relationship dynamic playing out with different people. The same self-sabotage appearing at the same threshold of success. The same conflict erupting in every friendship, every job, every living situation. Conscious you is confused. You changed the circumstances. You moved cities. You picked a different partner. Why does the same thing keep happening? Because the shadow is generating the pattern from underneath. The part of you that believes you don't deserve love will find ways to destroy love no matter who's offering it. The part of you that's terrified of visibility will find ways to shrink right when you're about to be seen. The pattern isn't in your circumstances, it's in your psychology. And until the shadow material driving it becomes conscious, changing your external situation is just rearranging furniture in a burning house. The third expression is what Jung called inflation and deflation. This is the shadow swinging the pendulum of your self-image. Someone with repressed grandiosity might oscillate between feeling secretly superior and feeling crushingly worthless. Someone with buried shame might project unshakable confidence 90% of the time and then collapse into self-loathing without warning. The swings feel random. They're not. They're the shadow surging up, disrupting the persona's carefully managed performance, then getting shoved back down until the next eruption. The fourth expression, and this one is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely, is physical and emotional exhaustion. Keeping the shadow contained takes energy, enormous, constant energy. Your psyche is running a full-time operation to make sure the rejected parts of yourself don't surface. That operation never stops. It runs while you sleep. It runs while you work. It runs during every conversation, every relationship, every moment of your life. And you feel the cost of it without knowing what's causing it. The fatigue that doesn't respond to rest. The heaviness that doesn't have an obvious source. The feeling of carrying something you can't put down because you can't see what you're holding. Many of his patients experienced dramatic increases in energy and vitality when shadow material was finally integrated. Not because anything in their external circumstances changed, but because the psyche was no longer spending all that energy on containment. The war inside ended, and the resources that had been devoted to fighting it became available for actually living. So if the shadow is this powerful and this disruptive, why do people resist looking at it? Why don't we just turn around and face what we've been hiding? This is where Jung's understanding goes deeper than most modern interpretations of his work. He recognized that shadow resistance isn't laziness or cowardice. It's a survival response, and it's intelligent. The shadow was created for a reason. The child who repressed their anger did it because expressing anger was genuinely unsafe in their environment. The person who buried their needs did it because having needs got them punished or abandoned. The individual who hid their power did it because being powerful threatened someone they depended on for survival. Every piece of the shadow exists because at some point, showing that piece would have cost something the person couldn't afford to lose. When you approach shadow work, you're not just asking someone to look at uncomfortable material. You're asking them to reverse a survival strategy that kept them safe during the most vulnerable period of their life. Their psyche doesn't know the danger has passed. It's still running the old program, still convinced that showing the shadow will result in the original consequence: rejection, abandonment, violence, loss of love. The resistance isn't irrational. It's the nervous system protecting what it learned needed protecting. This is why most surface-level approaches to shadow work fail. You can't just think your way into the shadow. You can't journal your way through it in a weekend. You can't attend a retreat and come home with your shadow integrated. Because the shadow isn't stored in your intellect, it's stored in your body, your nervous system, your automatic responses, your emotional reflexes. Accessing it requires more than understanding. It requires a willingness to feel what you've spent your entire life avoiding feeling. And that willingness is rare. Not because people are weak, but because what's stored in the shadow often includes pain that was genuinely overwhelming when it first occurred. The child who repressed grief did it because the grief was too big for their developing nervous system to process. The person who buried their terror did it because the terror was so complete that their psyche fragmented rather than feel it fully. Going back to that material means going back to the original overwhelm, now with adult resources, but still touching the same raw nerve. If you found yourself in the middle of that process, or standing at its edge wondering whether to step in, there's something that might help you hold the complexity of what you're facing. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built for exactly this kind of inner work. Not to rush you through it, but to give you a structure to hold on to when the ground feels uncertain. You'll find the link below. And what comes next in this conversation is just as important, because knowing why the shadow forms is only the beginning. The real question is what happens when you actually start working with it. So what does genuine shadow work look like? Not the aestheticized version, not shadow work as a brand identity, the actual psychological process that Jung described and that therapists working in his tradition have refined over decades. It starts with something deceptively simple: noticing. Before you can integrate the shadow, you have to become aware of where it's operating. And this is harder than it sounds because the shadow, by definition, is the part of your psychology you can't see. It's your blind spot. You've built your entire identity around not seeing it. So the first stage of shadow work is developing the ability to catch yourself in the act of being unconscious. Jung recommended paying close attention to 3 specific things. First, your projections. The qualities in others that trigger outsized emotional responses. Who makes you irrationally angry? Who do you admire so intensely it borders on worship? Who disgusts you in ways you can't fully explain? These reactions are data. They're your shadow announcing itself through the mirror of other people. Second, your dreams. Jung believed dreams were the shadow's most direct communication channel. The figures that appear in your dreams, the actions you take in dream space that you'd never take in waking life, the emotions that surface during sleep that you can't access during the day. Dreams bypass the persona entirely and speak from the unconscious without the filters your waking mind imposes. Third, your patterns. The recurring dynamics in your relationships, your career, your inner life. Where do you keep getting stuck? What situations do you keep recreating? What conflicts keep finding you no matter how much you try to avoid them? The pattern is the shadow's fingerprint. It reveals what's operating underneath by showing you its effects on the surface. This noticing phase can last months, sometimes years. It depends on how thick the persona is, how deep the repression goes, how much support you have. And it requires a specific psychological posture that most people find uncomfortable. Curiosity without judgment. You're not looking at your shadow material to fix it, shame yourself for it, or get rid of it. You're looking at it to see it, just to see it, to acknowledge that it exists and that it's part of you. This is where people get tripped up almost immediately, because the instinct when shadow material surfaces is to judge it, pathologize it, or try to transform it into something more acceptable. You discover repressed rage and immediately want to figure out how to release it in a healthy way. You uncover buried sexuality and want to decide whether it's okay. You find hidden selfishness and want to understand where it came from so you can eliminate it. Integration isn't about fixing the shadow, it's about accepting it, not acting on every shadow impulse, not letting your repressed rage destroy your relationships, not indulging every buried desire without discernment. Accepting it means acknowledging that this material is genuinely part of who you are, that you are a person who contains rage and tenderness, selfishness and generosity, darkness and light, that the wholeness Jung talked about isn't about becoming perfectly good, it's about becoming completely real. This distinction matters enormously because it determines whether shadow work actually works or just becomes another way of performing self-improvement. If you approach the shadow as something to fix, you're still operating from the same framework that created the shadow in the first place. You're still dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You've just moved the dividing line slightly. That's not integration, that's relocation. Real integration happens when you can sit with shadow material without needing to do anything about it, when you can feel the rage without acting on it or repressing it, when you can acknowledge the selfishness without either indulging it or punishing yourself for having it, when you can hold the fullness of who you are without collapsing into shame or inflating into justification. This is one of the most psychologically demanding things a person can do. It requires what Jung would have called the tension of opposites, the ability to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously without resolving them. I am kind and I contain cruelty. I am generous and I have greed. I want to help people and I sometimes want to burn everything down. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out, and you have to let them coexist without choosing one and rejecting the other, because that choosing and rejecting is exactly what built the shadow in the first place. The next stage of shadow work is what makes it genuinely transformative, and it's also where most people quit, because after you've noticed the shadow and begun to accept that it exists, you have to start feeling it. Not thinking about it, feeling it. In your body, in your nervous system, in the places where the original repression happened. The anger your father taught you to swallow didn't just disappear into a concept. It lodged in your jaw, your fists, your gut. The grief you couldn't show lives in your chest, your throat, the tension behind your eyes. The terror you survived by going numb is stored in your shoulders, your lower back, the way your body braces when someone raises their voice. Shadow work that stays intellectual never reaches this material. It produces insight but not integration. You understand your patterns, but you keep repeating them because the body hasn't gotten the memo. Feeling the shadow means allowing the original emotions to surface and be experienced with the resources you now have as an adult. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens in waves. A memory surfaces and brings grief with it. A situation triggers a rage response, and instead of shutting it down, you let yourself feel it without acting on it. A vulnerability you've been hiding for decades suddenly becomes visible, and the terror of being seen washes through you before slowly receding. Each wave of feeling is a small act of integration. You're showing your nervous system that the emotion it locked away is survivable, that you can feel this anger without being abandoned, that you can show this vulnerability without being destroyed, that the original danger has passed and the containment protocol can be relaxed. This is slow work. The nervous system doesn't update its programming based on a single experience. It needs repeated evidence that the old rules no longer apply. And here's the part that nobody preparing you for shadow work typically mentions. It gets worse before it gets better. significantly worse. When you start opening the door to the shadow, you don't get to choose which material comes through first. Sometimes it's manageable. Sometimes it's everything at once. People in the early stages of genuine shadow work often experience increased anxiety, depression, emotional volatility, vivid dreams, relationship disruptions, and a destabilizing sense of not knowing who they are anymore. This happens because the persona is destabilizing. The mask you've been wearing is cracking, and the face underneath isn't fully formed yet. You're in between identities. The old you, the one built around repression and performance, is breaking down. The new you, the integrated one, hasn't solidified. And the space between those two versions of yourself is terrifying, because there's no solid ground. You can't go back to who you were because you've seen too much. You can't rush forward to who you're becoming because integration takes its own time. Jung described this in-between state as necessary and unavoidable. He compared it to the alchemical process of nigredo, the blackening, where the original material has to dissolve completely before it can be reconstituted in a new form. You have to lose the shape you had before you can find the shape you're becoming. And that loss of shape feels like loss of self. It feels like falling apart. It feels, in the most visceral sense, like dying. This is where people need support the most, and where they're most likely to abandon the process, because everything in them is screaming to put the mask back on, to shove the shadow material back underground, to return to the familiar discomfort of repression rather than stay in the unfamiliar agony of dissolution. And many people do exactly that. They touch the shadow, feel the destabilization, and retreat. Then they spend years hovering at the edge, approaching and withdrawing, wanting integration but not willing to pay its price. Jung didn't judge this retreat harshly. He understood that the psyche has its own timeline, and that forcing shadow work before someone is ready can do more harm than good. But he also observed that the shadow doesn't stop pressing just because you've decided you're not ready. The patterns continue, the projections continue, the exhaustion continues, the repetitive dynamics continue. Retreating from shadow work doesn't return you to innocence. It returns you to the same suffering you were trying to escape, now with the added weight of knowing what's causing it. One of the most common mistakes people make in shadow work is trying to do it completely alone. There's a romantic idea about shadow work as solitary, heroic journey. You descend into your depths alone, face your demons alone, emerge transformed alone. And while there's an irreducible aloneness to the process, because ultimately only you can face your shadow, Jung was emphatic that doing this work without support is dangerous. The shadow is the part of your psychology you can't see clearly. That's its nature. You need other people, whether therapists, trusted friends, or communities committed to honest self-reflection, to help you see what you're blind to. You need mirrors, not people who will tell you what you want to hear, but people who can reflect back what they see with compassion and without flinching. People who won't shame you for what emerges, but also won't let you bypass it with intellectual explanations. Jung's own process of confronting his shadow, which he documented extensively in what became the Red Book, involved sustained dialogue with figures from his unconscious. He treated the shadow not as pathology to eliminate, but as a voice to engage with. He asked questions of his shadow material. He listened to what it had to say. He entered into relationship with the parts of himself he'd been treating as enemies. This relational approach to the shadow is crucial and often overlooked. Most people approach their shadow the way they approach a problem. How do I solve this? How do I fix it? How do I get past it? But Jung would have called that the wrong question entirely. The shadow doesn't need to be solved. It needs to be heard. It needs to be included. It needs to stop being treated as the enemy and start being recognized as a part of yourself that's been in exile, desperately trying to come home. When you shift from fighting the shadow to listening to it, something changes. The rage that seemed destructive reveals the boundaries you've been unable to set. The grief that seemed bottomless reveals the love you've been afraid to feel. The selfishness that seemed shameful reveals the self-care you've been denying yourself. The shadow isn't the opposite of who you are. It's the completion of who you are. Every quality it contains has a function. Every emotion it holds carries information. Every impulse it generates is pointing towards something your conscious self has been missing. This is the paradox at the heart of shadow work. The things you're most afraid to face are the things you most need. Your power is in the shadow. Your authenticity is in the shadow. Your capacity for real intimacy, not the performance of intimacy, but the actual vulnerable thing, that's in the shadow too. It's in there because those qualities were too threatening to the people who raised you, or too big for the environment you grew up in, or too alive for the deadness that surrounded you. There's another dimension of shadow work that most modern discussions barely touch: the collective shadow. Your personal shadow, the one built from your individual history, exists inside a larger cultural shadow. The qualities your culture rejects, demonizes, and refuses to acknowledge in itself. And those collective shadow elements infiltrate your personal psychology whether you realize it or not. A culture that represses grief produces individuals who can't cry. A culture that demonizes anger creates people who can't set boundaries. A culture that fears the feminine, in men or women, creates people who can't access vulnerability, receptivity, or emotional depth. Your shadow isn't just yours, it's partially inherited. It contains material from your family system, your cultural context, your historical moment. Shadow work, when done thoroughly, eventually brings you into contact with this collective layer. And that's when the work becomes not just personal healing, but something larger. Jung believed that individuals who did their shadow work were doing something essential for the collective, because every person who integrates their shadow withdraws their projections from the world. They stop needing enemies to carry their disowned darkness. They stop needing heroes to carry their disowned light. They become more psychologically complete, which means they engage with reality more honestly, which means they contribute to a culture that's slightly more conscious than it was before. This isn't grandiose, it's practical. A parent who integrates their shadow raises children who don't need to repress as much. A leader who knows their shadow makes decisions from wholeness rather than from compensated wound. A friend who's done their inner work can hold space for your pain without needing to fix it, rescue you from it, or collapse under the weight of it. Shadow work ripples outward. It has to, because who you are in relationship with yourself determines who you are in relationship with everyone else. So what does it actually feel like when shadow integration starts to take hold? When the material that was buried begins to find its place in your conscious life, the first thing most people notice is a decrease in reactivity. The things that used to trigger a hurricane of emotion now produce something closer to a strong breeze. Not because you've become numb or detached, but because the shadow material that was being activated by the trigger has been acknowledged. It doesn't need to scream anymore. It's been heard. So the trigger still registers, but it doesn't hijack you. You feel the anger or the hurt or the fear, and instead of being consumed by it, you recognize it. You know where it comes from. You can hold it without being held by it. The second shift is a strange kind of relaxation. Not relaxation in the vacation sense, more like the relaxation of a muscle that's been clenched for so long you forgot it was clenched. The exhaustion from maintaining the persona starts to lift because the persona is loosening. You don't have to work so hard to be acceptable. You don't have to monitor yourself so constantly for leaks of shadow material. The internal surveillance system starts powering down because there's less to surveil. What was hidden is becoming visible, and it turns out the visibility doesn't destroy you the way you were taught it would. The third shift is one that catches people off guard. Your relationships change. Some of them improve dramatically because you're finally showing up as a whole person instead of a carefully curated performance. The people who can handle your authenticity draw closer. The intimacy deepens because you're actually in the room now, not hiding behind a persona. But some relationships deteriorate because certain connections were built on your persona and they require the persona to survive. The friend who needs you to always be the helper falls away when you start having needs of your own. The partner who was attracted to your performance gets uncomfortable when the real you starts showing up. The family member who needs you to play your assigned role in the family system pushes back when you stop playing it. This is one of the most painful parts of shadow integration. Realizing that some of the people in your life don't actually know you. They know the persona. They love the mask. And when the mask comes off, they don't recognize what's underneath, or they recognize it and they don't want it. This loss is real. Jung never minimized it. He acknowledged that individuation, the process of becoming whole, often comes with a period of significant relational upheaval. You're not the same person anymore, and not everyone who loved the old you will love the new one. The fourth shift is the emergence of qualities you didn't know you had. Or rather, qualities you always had but couldn't access. People who integrate shadow rage often discover their capacity for passionate advocacy. People who integrate shadow grief find a depth of compassion they couldn't reach before. People who reclaim buried ambition suddenly have energy for projects and visions that felt impossible when half their psyche was devoted to containment. The shadow, once integrated, doesn't disappear. It becomes fuel. The energy that was locked up in repression becomes available for living. Jung described this as the gold in the shadow. The idea that your greatest gifts are often hidden in the same place as your greatest shame. The very thing you were most afraid to face turns out to be the thing you most need. Your wildness is there. Your power is there. Your creativity, your passion, your capacity for deep feeling. The parts of you that are most vibrantly alive. They've been waiting in the dark for you to come find them. There's something that needs to be said about the timeline of this work, because the culture we live in has very little patience for processes that can't be optimized and accelerated. Shadow work is not a weekend project. It's not a 30-day challenge. It's not something you complete and then move on from. Jung worked with his own shadow his entire life. He was in his 80s and still discovering material he hadn't integrated. Not because he was failing at the work, but because the psyche has layers, and each layer of integration reveals the next one. This doesn't mean you'll be in psychological crisis forever. The acute phase of shadow work, the destabilization and dissolution and identity confusion, does pass. But the broader process of meeting yourself, of staying curious about what's unconscious, of catching your projections, of feeling what needs to be felt, that continues. It becomes a way of living rather than a task to complete. And honestly, there's a freedom in that. In letting go of the idea that you'll ever be finished, ever be perfectly healed, ever have it all figured out. That pressure to be done is just the persona reasserting itself, wanting to claim the gold star of completion. If this process resonates with where you are right now, or if you're looking for a way to start doing this work with some structure to hold on to, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's framework, designed to help you face what's hiding and find your way within. The link is below whenever you're ready.